Welcome to Death on Clear Island, Chapter 25A. The next morning, the radio promised several days of beautiful weather with temperatures in the 70s, but no amount of sunshine could dispel my dark mood. I hadn't slept much, thinking about Dylan and our life together. Isn't that ironic? Here I was in Ireland without him, and the very secrets he thought to keep from me were now ripped open. Secrets. Some people say that everyone keeps secrets, but how many is too many? And how do we keep our secrets from destroying other people's lives? Matthew had kept secrets from his sister, and now he was dead. Sharon, too, had kept secrets. I was sure of it, and she was also dead. Dylan's secrets had been hiding in a country 3,000 miles away from where we existed in the United States. I wondered what other secrets the future held as I rolled up into a ball, pulled the covers over my head, and cried. I mourned for Dylan and what we'd had together and what we'd missed because of his damn secrets. When I heard the banging on the back door, I ignored it, thinking it might be Lorcan again. But I didn't stop. But it didn't stop. I knew then that it was Aunt Georgina. When I opened the door a few minutes later, she swept into the room and pulled me into a huge hug. Tears spilled down my face as she rocked me back and forth like a mother lulling its child to peaceful sleep. Finally, she held me at arm's length and said, I don't know what was wrong with that nephew of mine. She sat me down at the table and busied herself with filling the kettle and setting it on the stove to boil. Did you know? I asked. Suddenly it was important for me to know if she had been part of decisions that Dylan had made. She balanced herself on the chair opposite me. I never knew about you until Dylan died. I nodded. It's okay, Aunt Georgina. I don't blame you for keeping his secrets. Now you listen to me, Star O'Brien. I didn't know about you until Dylan had his heart attack. He was a wee lad, just 4 years old, when his mother, my sister, went to the States. At the moment, it struck me that Dylan hadn't ever said much about his parents, just that they were deceased. She embraced her life there completely, Georgina went on, and never crossed the Atlantic again. Once Dylan became a teenager, she'd send him to Ireland in the summer to visit my mother, his grandmother, in this house. Even though my sister hated the wet weather and the poverty she'd left behind, I think she wanted him to understand where he'd come from. I'd see him briefly when he'd arrive, but I never took too much notice of him otherwise. I was busy living my own life. Then, when he began his import business, he'd stop here once in a while for a day or two. The kettle's whistle pierced the air. Aunt Georgina stood and made 2 cups of steaming tea. She pressed one of the mugs, which held a peppermint tea bag, between my hands. You didn't notice that he'd stopped coming here? I shook my head in disbelief. That doesn't sound like you. You know everything there is to know about the comings and goings in this county. I blew on my tea and waited for her reaction. Well, I didn't know that. Dylan arrived here on one of his whirlwind visits about 5 years ago and let me know that his business had grown so much that he couldn't take time to mind the cottage anymore. Said he'd hire John Barrett to take care of the place, mow the lawn, and get someone in to dust. So other than a card at the holidays saying all is well and see you soon, he dropped off my radar. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. Believe me when I tell you, I didn't know about you until a solicitor contacted us to say that Dylan had died and you would be coming here to settle his estate. But why didn't you say anything when you met me? About what? All I knew was that you'd been named executor of his estate. And when I met you and saw how fragile you were with grief for Dylan, I didn't want to add to your burden by asking you why Dylan never introduced you to his friends and families. Aunt Georgina moved her cup around on the table. Believe me, I didn't know, and I wouldn't do anything to hurt you, Star. Belief. I took heart from Aunt Georgina's words. I'd gotten accustomed to her whirlwind arrivals and departures and her concern for me. I couldn't bear it if I lost her too. Drink some tea before it goes cold, she said. I nodded and took a sip while I studied the hazel trees through the kitchen window. What about Lorcan? I asked. Do you trust him? Of course I trust him. When he called me this morning, he was concerned about you. He told me the whole story. Georgina shook her head, threw the ends of her scarf back behind her shoulders, and leaned forward. I always assumed that he never mentioned Dylan for the same reason I didn't, because Dylan was out of sight and therefore out of mind. Now that I know what happened, I see the last 5 years very differently. Yes, I believe Lorcan when he says that he and Dylan had a falling out. Georgina shook her head again. More silly behavior. Isn't it interesting how one action, one relationship can haunt us for our entire life? She paused here, then looked directly into my eyes. Star, I know you do everything you can not to show how fragile you are. This has all been a terrible shock for you, of course. But I also know that underneath this hurt and grief is a strong, brave, and independent woman. She's the one to nurture. I shook my head slowly in agreement, stood up, and leaned over to give her a kiss on the cheek. Thank you, Aunt Georgina. Of course, she replied. Then she glanced at her watch, jumped up from the chair, and straightened her scarf. Now, I have a client meeting me at the shop this morning, so I have to run. Don't forget what I said. And with that, she was out the door and up the road. As I watched her walk away, I wanted to pull open the door, run after her, and beg for a hug. Instead, I threw myself on the love seat and wrapped my arms around my shaking body. What would my life have been like if my mother hadn't disappeared? For one thing, I doubt I would have made information brokering my life's work. Nor would I have met Dylan or the O'Briens. And I certainly wouldn't be lying in French Hill Cottage mourning the Dylan I'd known. In my gut, I knew that he loved me despite the secrets. My work has taught me that sometimes we have to accept the path that our choices puts us on. I've also learned that not every loving intention is pure. What would life have been like?